Welcome to the webinar, Is Your Money Destroying Forests or Violating Rights of the Forest and Finance Coalition? This is Marilia Monteiro. I'm Forest Campaign at BankTrack. I will first inform you about the translation. The webinar will be translated in Indonesian and French. In order to activate the interpretation, please follow the steps. You first have to click the interpretation globe on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Select the language you want to hear the webinar in, and please note, if you want to hear the audio in Indonesian, click the channel Japanese. Unfortunately, Zoom doesn't have an Indonesian channel at this time. So click on Mute Original Audio when you do not want to hear the original speaker's voice. Don't forget to unmute later as needed. During the webinar, you can also write your questions in the Q&A box. So the purpose of this webinar is to present the key findings of the Forest and Finance new and expanded database. So a brief introduction of the Forest and Finance work. It was first launched in 2016 by the three partners Profundo, Tuki Indonesia, and Run, as a platform and web tool that revealed the financial flows into forest risk commodity companies in Southeast Asia and provided financial and policy analysis. The Forest and Finance website can be used by many different audiences, including by civil society organizations to work on strategic campaigns to convince financial institutions to use their leverage over forest risk sectors by adopting and implementing in stronger ESG policies and due diligence systems. So now, with the Forest and Finance expansion, for the first time, it also covers Brazil and Central and West Africa, and also new commodities like soy and beef. As we know, the agricultural expansion of these commodities is directly linked to deforestation, since the forest land and tropical forests continue to be converted to commercial land uses. The policy assessment will also be extended to cover 100 banks and 100 investors. Now with the Forest and Finance Coalition also became a broader coalition with three new partners, the Amazon Watch, BankTrack, and Repórter Brasil. So some of the new findings is that around 51,000 financial deals were identified, 153.2 billion US dollars in credit to forest risk companies since the Paris Agreement, and investments of 37.3 billion US dollars in 2020. Now we will first give the floor to Vard Warmerdam, who is an economic researcher at Profundo and has collected the data for the Forest and Finance database.
Thank you, Marilia. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So my name is Vard Warmerdam, and I'll be presenting the research methodology used for Forest and Finance project and some of the findings. So the overview of my presentation is I'll give a brief introduction of the methodology, brief overview. Of course, many more details can be found in the research methodology that is on the Forest and Finance website, providing lots of details on many of the things that I will describe today. I will discuss the research findings in two categories: the creditors, analysis of the creditors to the forest risk companies, and analysis of the investors in the forest risk companies. And then I'll hand over to Rainforest Action Network, who will discuss some of the bank portfolio examples of banks' portfolios in terms of what they're financing in the forest finance database. So how was this research conducted? Well, as Maria has introduced, we looked at 3 forest-rich regions. These are Brazil, Central and West Africa, and Southeast Asia. So we've expanded from Southeast Asia into Brazil and Central and West Africa. We looked at 6 forest risk commodities. These are beef, pulp and paper, palm oil, rubber, timber, and soy. And for each of the 3 regions, we had to use a slightly different, and the 6 commodities, we had to use a slightly different approach to selecting the relevant companies to research. For palm oil, pulp and paper, and rubber, particularly in Southeast Asia, the company selection was based on the concession area, so the plantation areas. For beef and soy, particularly in Brazil, the selection was based on beef and soy production figures, but taking only the largest beef and soy producers. And for pulp and paper, we also looked at both a combination of production capacity and concession areas. We've also included some timber companies and palm oil companies as they come through as we've identified. In Central and West Africa, the focus was primarily on companies with concessions and operations in and around the Tridom region. It is a nature reserve that covers the border of 3 countries: Gabon, Cameroon, and Republic of Congo. Taking the concessions, companies with concessions, particularly timber concessions and agro commodities there, but also looked at, also selected companies elsewhere in the region, in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Ghana, which are active also in forest-rich areas and the focused forest risk commodities. So, particularly in that case, palm oil and rubber. For the data sources we used for the financial research are, we started with Bloomberg and Thomson. Bloomberg and Thomson, or now called Refinitiv, are large financial databases used globally by the financial industry and analysts and consultants. That was used to identify syndicated financing, so financing where more than one financial institution participates in the provision of a loan or a bond issuance or a share issuance. We also used those databases to identify bondholders and shareholders. We added IJ Global for project finance, trade finance analytics for trade finance, and we used company publications and company registries for a more detailed bilateral financial relationships. So where one bank provides lending or other financing to one company. There are a number of limitations of these data sources. So as I mentioned, both Bloomberg and Thomson only provide syndicated financing, or primarily provide syndicated financing. That's why we have to rely on the company registries, company publications, and media for bilateral financial information, bilateral deals. However, you're limited by in these instances, by the jurisdictional requirements. So for Indonesian companies, for example, it is easier to find information on who their banks are if they're stock listed companies, because that's generally reported in the annual reports of the companies. For Malaysian and Singaporean companies, there is more of a limit of how much is then published in the annual reports of stock listed companies in terms of who their banks are. But we can find additional information in company registries and media archives. For this research, there are a number of calculated elements. Part of this is due to the limitations of the data sources. So I mentioned that Bloomberg and Thomson have syndicated financing, but one of the things that's missing, not always, but often, is how much each financial institution contributed to a particular deal. So you have the total deal value, let's say 100 million, and we see there are 10 banks, but we don't know which financial institution provided how much financing specifically. So we calculate that. In some cases, and particularly in Bloomberg, there are such figures, but not always. So in some instances, we've had to calculate that. And I'm going to describe that in more detail, how we calculate that in just a minute. Also, because Forest and Finance is focused on forest activities or forest operations or forest risk activities, we calculate the proportion of a total company's business activities that are in one of the 6 forest risk commodities, or a combination of the 6 if they are active in more than one commodity. This is to make sure that the figures we are reporting can actually be called forest risk figures or forest finance figures rather than the total. I'm going to describe that in a little bit more detail again in a minute. And finally, another element that we've calculated for the research, particularly for Southeast Asia, is the geographic adjustment. So some of the companies we are researching are active in more than one geography. Some of them are actually active in all 3 of the forest risk rich regions that we're analyzing. And we needed to calculate the proportion of the company's activities in each of the 3 or in more than one of the geographies, so that we can come to an accurate indication of how much money is going to a particular segment in a particular geography. These are all estimations, of course, because the companies don't report on these figures themselves in terms of how much money they are spending specifically in one commodity and in a geography. However, these estimations help to give us a clearer picture of potentially how much money is going to Southeast Asian palm oil or Brazilian pulp and paper, for example. I'm going to go through these 3 calculated elements in more detail now. So let's take Sinarmas, for example. Sinarmas subsidiary Iwamas Tunggal attracted a loan of 150 million in 2016. 7 financial institutions participated in this deal. 5 of these were book runners. This makes a book ratio of 0.4. Now, the detailed methodology on the Forest and Finance website will explain what these different book ratios mean, but just very briefly now is over the years we've collected data of we had 500,000 rows of data of where we did identify or did know the deal contribution per financial institution. And we've come up with a couple of ranges and types of finance where we see that the majority of deals with this range of book ratio, for example, and this type of finance, so a loan or an issuance, means a split of how much money is being provided by book runners and how much money is being provided by the other participants. And this ratio, we did this with a regression analysis, proved to be very effective. Financial institutions that have verified our data that we've sent to them generally say that we have a deviation of about 2% from what they have. So let's look at this example again. So the $150 million loan, 7 banks, 5 of these are book runners. In this case, the book ratio is 0.4, which means that 75% of the financing is provided by the book runners. As there were 5 book runners, they're each providing 15%. The remaining 2 are normal participants, and they provide 25%. And in this case, that's 12.5% each. Sorry. And this is what it then looks like. So 150 million divided by 12.5% of 150 million is then 18.75 that we attribute to First Abu Dhabi, or 15% for the book runner Bank Mandiri means they've provided 22.5 million in our calculations. So this is the deal contribution calculation. We're going to go on to the segment adjusters. So let's have a look. Kuala Lumpur Kapong, or KLK, has 5 reportable operating segments as noted in their annual report. These are plantation, manufacturing, property development, investment holding, and others. For KLK, they have segment capital expenditures. This is our preferred financial indicator that we use for segment adjusters, because capital expenditures essentially means the money that's coming in through a loan is going to be spent for what in the capital expenditures. If we don't have segment capital expenditures, we look at segment assets where that's available, or segment revenues, which is our least preferred option. But we have to look at what's available in the financial report. All of this information, each calculation per year, each segment adjuster per year is on Forest and Finance website, including details of exactly how it was calculated, which indicators we were using. It also includes the formulas that we use, so they can all be verified, including with sources and page numbers and everything for anyone to have a look at. So just to summarize then, for KLK, they have 5 reportable operating segments. for palm oil and pulp and paper, for palm oil and rubber, which they're active in, we were using the plantation and manufacturing segments. Property development, investment holding, and others weren't relevant for either of these two commodities. So using the segment capital expenditures for palm oil, here you can see 504,448 and 123,218. This is the capital expenditures for plantation and manufacturing, adjusted by the planted area of palm oil 213,377, and the total planted area is 224,454, divided by the total capital expenditures of 644,558, meaning we have a segment adjuster of 92.6 for palm oil. And looking at rubber, we see there's the same segment capital expenditures because it refers to the same segments, but we see a different planted area of 11077, so a much smaller planted area for rubber. And the rest of the equation is the same. We end up with a rubber adjuster of 4.8%. Now, then we apply these adjusters to the total value. Here we see they've provided the CIMB and Maybank participated in a bond issuance to KLK in 2019. They've provided around 119 million. And then we adjust these for palm oil 110.5 and rubber 5.7. So really the figures that we're reporting here are then per commodity, how much financing is being provided by each of the financial institutions. And this is how it's listed in our databases as well. That was the segments adjusters. And the final calculated element that I'll describe is the geographic adjuster. Again, we can take KLK as a good example because it operates a palm oil company in Liberia, Equatorial Palm Oil. Equatorial Palm Oil does not have any rubber or any other forest risk operations. So that's easy for the example. The geographic adjuster is then based on the planted area proportions in Liberia and in Southeast Asia. So in this case, it's Malaysia and Indonesia. So the Liberian palm oil planted area was 13,007 out of the 213,377, meaning its palm oil adjuster is then 6.1% of its total planted area is in Liberia. 93.4 is in 94% is in Southeast Asia. So when we applied this adjuster, then it's 6.1% for Liberia, we can apply that to the 92.6% we had from the previous adjuster for palm oil, and we see that palm oil in Central and West Africa is 5.6%. That's the adjuster we've applied. And then for Southeast Asia, we have the 92.6% in palm oil as we had from the previous slide, and the 93.9% of the Southeast Asian palm oil planted area, which means that we have a geographic applied segment adjuster of 86.9% palm oil in Southeast Asia. Then when we look at the values again, we see the 120 or 119 the same bond issuance we're taking as the example of that. We applied that 5.6%, meaning we have 3.3 million in palm oil in Central and West Africa. They have no rubber activity, so this is 0. And the Southeast Asia palm oil is then 107, and Southeast Asia rubber is unchanged from last time, so 5.7. So that was the research methodology that we've used. And now let's have a look at the findings. So we split them into creditors and investors. Creditors are the providers of loans and issuance underwriting services. As Maria has mentioned, $154 billion was provided in loans and underwriting services to the 6 forest risk commodities, or companies engaged in the 6 forest risk commodities in the 3 forest-rich regions. Of that, we see that approximately a quarter is in beef, a fifth is in palm oil, around about a third is in pulp and paper, and much smaller proportions for rubber, soy, and timber. Generally, we see there's an increasing trend with a spike in 2018 and a dip in 2017. In Southeast Asia specifically, $54 billion of credit was provided since Paris in 2016, or Paris 2015, but since 2016. In Southeast Asia, more than half of that financing is going to palm oil. Just under a third is for pulp and paper, a bit for rubber and timber, but not so much for soy and beef. These are not the drivers, the agro-commodity drivers of deforestation really in Southeast Asia. We see there's a dip in 2017, which we also saw on the previous overall slide, but generally there's an increase. Of the total, 84% is being provided by financial institutions. And so of the financing of the credit that's going to Southeast Asian forest risk companies, 84% is being provided by Asian financial institutions. Half of that, just under half of that, is provided by Southeast Asian financial institutions, particularly as you'll see, Indonesian, Malaysian, and Singaporean financial institutions, and just over a third by East Asian, so Chinese, Taiwanese, Japanese, and South Korean. Looking at a little bit more detail of what these Southeast Asian and East Asian financial institutions are financing, of 57% of total palm oil financing identified was financed by Southeast Asian financial institutions. 45% of all pulp and paper financing came from Southeast Asian financial institutions. East Asian financial institutions financed about a fifth of all palm oil and just under half of all pulp and paper. 92% of the credit provided to these forest risk commodities in Southeast Asia was provided by financial institutions from 10 countries. Among the top of these are Indonesia, China, Malaysia, Japan, and Singapore. 46% of this total financing was actually provided by just 10 banks. Maybank, BRI from Indonesia, Bank Mandiri, Mitsubishi, BNI. Four of these financial institutions, four of these banks are UNPRB signatories, and later Rainforest Action Network will explain the relevance of this. Now moving on to the investor side. Investors are those who invest in bonds and shares of companies, or the shares of listed companies and the bonds of companies that have issued bonds, generally insurance companies, asset managers, pension funds. We see that these investors, these institutional investors, held $37 billion in investments in companies engaged in the 6 forest risk commodities at the most recent filing date in April 2020. 3/4 of this financing, of these investments, were in palm oil and pulp and paper, with a little bit in beef and a little bit in rubber overall. 56% of these investments came from only 10 investors. You see among the top PMB, EPF, both Malaysian financial institutions, BNDES from Brazil, Vanguard, BlackRock, the big US asset managers. Looking specifically at Southeast Asia, 24 billion was held at the most recent filing date in April 2020. Companies engaged in the 6 forest risk commodities, specifically active in Southeast Asia. The vast majority of this was in palm oil. 82% of all identified investments in bonds and shares in Southeast Asia was only in palm oil. And 60% of this came from regional investors, from Southeast Asian financial institutions. 20% came from North America. Malaysian investors actually accounted for 56% of the total investments, and US investors also dominate with 18%. But the top 3 investors in the forest risk companies in Southeast Asia were all Malaysian government-linked financial institutions, PMB, EPF, and QAP, QAP Retirement Fund. 6 of these are actually UNPRI signatories, including EPF, QAP, and of course from Malaysia, but also the Government Pension Investment Fund from Japan, Vanguard, and BlackRock. And now Rainforest Action Network will continue this by explaining more about individual cases of banks. bank portfolio examples.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Art, for the presentation of the methodology and some of the key findings. I would now like to zoom in and analyze the portfolio of 4 of the largest banks financing forest risk commodity companies in Southeast Asia. I'll start with CIMB, which is a Malaysian bank and a signatory to the UNPRB, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Banking. It is also one of the top 10 largest creditors for Southeast Asian forest risk commodity companies. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, in other words, since the beginning of 2016, it has provided $2.1 billion in credit to forest risk commodity companies, of which 3/4 was allocated to the palm oil sector and another 18% to the rubber sector. Among its largest clients is the CIMB Group, a company involved in serious social and environmental conflicts, about which we will speak more later. Next, Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, or MUFG. This is the largest of the 3 Japanese mega banks and a parent company of Bank Danamon, Indonesia's 6th largest bank by assets. MUFG has forestry and palm oil sector policies and is a signatory to the UNPRB. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, it has provided $2.9 billion in credit to forest risk commodity companies. Of this total, 40% was allocated to the palm oil sector and another 45% to the pulp and paper sector in both Southeast Asia and Brazil. It is among the top 10 largest creditors for Southeast Asian forest risk commodity companies, with significant financing to palm oil. Among its largest clients are several companies involved in serious social and environmental conflicts, again like CIMB, but also CIMB Group and RGE. BNI, Bank Negara Indonesia, is an Indonesian state-owned bank which has not signed the UNPRB. It is among the top 5 of the largest creditors for Southeast Asian forest risk commodity companies. Since Paris, it has provided $2.4 billion in credit to forest risk commodity companies, of which 2/3 was allocated to the palm oil sector and another 1/3 to the pulp and paper sector. Its largest client by far is the rather problematic CIMB Group. And as last example, DBS, a bank from Singapore, which has ESG policies that are a bit stronger than those of the average bank in Southeast Asia, including an NDPE policy for palm oil. But it has not yet signed on to the UNPRB. Since the Paris Agreement, it has provided $2.4 billion in credit to forest risk commodity companies, of which over 60% was allocated to the palm oil sector and another 22% to the rubber sector. Its largest clients include CIMB Group and CIMB. CIMB Group is a major palm oil producer with prolonged issues of illegal labor exploitation. CIMB is involved in large-scale deforestation in Central and West Africa. Today marks the first anniversary of the UNPRB. More than 185 banks have opted to become signatories, and by doing so, they commit to the UNPRB's 6 principles. The first of this being the alignment of their business strategy with the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, among others. While the first reports by the UNPRB banks are only due in another 6 months, a quick analysis of the portfolio of 2 of these signatory banks seems to indicate that these are not yet aligned with the UNPRB's principles. CIMB, as we saw, is a major client of both CIMB and MUFG. And our next presenter will explain why CIMB is such a problematic company. I will pass it on to the moderator, Meridia.
Thanks, Mary, for this great analysis. The next speaker is Edi Sutrisno, who is the Executive Director of TUC Indonesia. And he will be speaking in Indonesian, so make sure to activate the Indonesian channel, which is the Japanese channel that's need to be activated in the Zoom. We will give us the translators some time to set up, and meanwhile you can comment or write your questions in the Q&A box, please. So Eddie, please, you can start.
Thank you, Marilia. Thank you to all the participants who are here today in this webinar. I will talk to you today about Sinarmas's corporate practices in its palm oil and forest plantation industries. As we've heard from Ward and Merrill, operations of these companies are inseparable from the roles of financial services institutions. I will talk to you about the impacts of the financing provided to these companies towards the social and environmental aspects. As we know, Sinarmas is a major group in Indonesia, and we know that it is a company built by the late Eka Cipta Wijaya. I'd like to show you the structure of the company, specifically its forestry industry. This is a complex structure with small fonts, and like Ward said, it was not easy to search and compile all this data with a structure like this. What I'd like to say here is that if we're looking at a certain company, we shouldn't look only at the ones in Indonesia. From the structure, it is clear that many companies owned by Sinarmas is also based in Singapore, in British Virgin Islands, and other tax haven countries. This is Sinarmas's ownership structure, specifically for palm oil. As we can see, it's quite complex, though not as complex as its palm oil sector. We must understand that Indonesia, through presidential regulation, is pushing for companies to report their beneficial ownership. And we're sharing this to push for transparency so that the public and specifically financial services institution can understand. They need to understand. If they do not understand the structure and all those linked to Sinarmas or a certain company group, it would be difficult for financial services institution to conduct due diligence and law enforcement. As we know, Indonesia's total land area covers 191.6 million hectares. 6% of the total land area in Indonesia is controlled by 29 palm oil and forestry tycoons. If we look further, Sinarmas actually controls 2% of the total land area in Indonesia through these two sectors, oil palm and forestry. You can see this in our publications from 2018 for the palm oil sector, and our publication from 2019 on the forestry sector. Not only Sinarmas, there are also other large companies. For example, Salim, Jardine Matheson, or as we know, Astra in Indonesia, which is a subsidiary of Jardine Matheson. There's also Surya Dumai and various company groups, including Corindo and Marubeni. Among all of Sinarmas's commitments, as we know, they have been busy creating and announcing their internal policies. However, we have observed that there are still social and environmental impacts still happening. Sinarmas, through its subsidiaries or supply chain, has an extensive track record of violations. These include violations of community rights, such as conflicts and land grabbing. There are at least 100 communities in conflicts involving Sinarmas. In 2019, our data shows that Sinarmas's forestry concession or pulp and paper concession has had the largest burned area of any companies in 2019. We thought this would end in 2020. However, in 2020, Sinarmas was still linked to a high number of conflicts. Several months ago, in their concession in Jambi, there was a conflict where the company sprayed local communities' crops using herbicide. The crops were then destroyed. This is a breach of Sinarmas's own commitments. And this also goes against the commitments and programs of the Indonesian government. The government is declaring for food security, but then communities' croplands are sacrificed for corporate interests. In addition to community conflicts, in APP's concession, a Sumatran tiger was found killed inside that concession. This is a concern for us all. Financial services institutions must know this. When we are committed to wildlife conservation, however, there is still a case where a rare Sumatran tiger is found killed in APP's concession. Also in Sumatra Island, an indigenous man was reported and criminalized by Sinarmas for cutting down 20 trees. Bongku, this man, was then sentenced to 1 year in prison. So in the midst of all these conflicts and during this COVID-19 pandemic, how come Sinarmas is doing this? Instead, they should be supporting communities who are dealing with the pandemic. Sinarmas also cleared 3,500 hectares land on peatland and built about approximately 53 kilometers drainage canal. Clearly, this is a violation of Sinarmas's own commitments. They said they're committed to not clear peatland, but in reality, this is still taking place. This must be noted by the public, financial services institution, and markets, especially the government and its law enforcement. In this context, we cannot just note that companies already have policies in place, but we must also monitor what is happening on the ground. The public and all stakeholders must push for the implementation of sustainable development practices. As I said earlier, in 2020, Sinarmas is still linked to various social and environmental impacts. We have conducted monitoring, and this data is available and can be accessed in our Fire and Finance website. In Indonesia, there are many hotspots and fire spots. The yellow area here are hotspots located outside of palm and forest plantation concessions. We have to note that hotspots are found not only in these two concession types, but can also be found in other land use types, such as mining or other land use. Here, we can see that in the palm oil concessions in other groups other than Sinarmas, the hotspots are still relatively high. Sinarmas itself both in its palm oil and forestry concessions, also still has hotspots. The hotspots declined on May, and we were quite happy, but then increased again on June to August. The question is the number going to increase or decrease in September? There are tendencies that in palm oil and forest plantation concessions, hotspots tend to increase on September. So we have to continue this. We have to continue to monitor the increasing number of hotspots and fire spots in both concession types. As I said earlier, Sinarmas, through its subsidiary APP, also cleared peatland. We know that in fact they have a policy that they often announce, that they often publicize. The organization Jikalahari in Riau province has reported PT Arara Abadi to the police. This is for land clearing and intentional burning, which not only violates Sinarmas's own policies, but is also a violation of Indonesian regulations. Financial services institution must then look into company practices and how they link to non-compliances. This is an important note for financial services institution and law enforcement in Indonesia. As we've heard from Ward and Merrill, we're going to talk about financial services institutions who are financing corporates and their impacts on the environment. Sinarmas has several major financiers. For example, BRI, BNI, BCA, Mizuho, ICBC, Paninbank, Mandiri, Maybank, MUFG, and Bank of China. BRI's financing has increased for Sinarmas, when we know that in fact Sinarmas in 2019 still had fires in their concessions. However, how come BRI is still financing them? This must be underlined. There should be an evaluation. Sinarmas's track record with repeat fires in their concessions and conflicts, peatland clearing. However, this track record is not important enough for banks to stop their financing. So we must underline this. This is financing from several financiers for Sinarmas's palm oil and pulp and paper industries. BRI is one of the largest financiers for Sinarmas, with all of the money going into pulp and paper. BNI finances both industries, although the greater percentage is allocated for pulp and paper. Similarly with BCA, also provides significant financing for pulp and paper. There's also Maybank, which is a Malaysian bank. We've published a report on Maybank previously. We hope that Maybank continues to improve their regulations and implementation for all of their clients. There are also Mizuho, Mandiri, and CIMB. So this is financing as of April 2020. Sinarmas's track record since 2015 to April 2020 should be noted. However, it seems that the financing will continue to increase. In addition, here we have bond and shareholders of Sinarmas as of April 2020. As Ward explained earlier about the investors, here we have Silchester International Investors with significant financing for palm oil. The media especially must inform investors and shareholders that their investment are actually going or are actually flowing into companies that are still linked to social and environmental conflicts. Now, what can the banks do? There is a lot that banks can do to reduce social and environmental risks and to improve these conditions. In our opinion, with Sinarmas's repeat breach of regulations in Indonesia, failing to meet their own commitments, with that, bank, banks should review existing financing lines and halt new financing. So they must conduct review of this financing and stop any new financing for Sinarmas. Secondly, banks must adopt and fully implement NDPE policies and also require from all of their clients, especially major groups like Sinarmas. The banks must also insist that their clients and also their entire supply chains, because we have strong suspicions that holding companies and subsidiaries are improving their performances, but their supply chains are still far behind. So it is important that the financial services institution ensures that their clients, not only subsidiaries but also their supply chains, must comply with regulations and aim for sustainable development so that sustainable financing can be implemented by the financial services institution. Financiers also need to implement this. They need to implement clear zero tolerance approach to burning so that if their clients intentionally start fires or are negligent in preventing them, banks must then stop new lines of credit for those clients. So that is my presentation. I hand back the time to the moderator. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie, for your presentation of the case study on cinemas. Many thanks to all the speakers for the exciting presentations. And as the webinar draws to a close, before we move to the questions, it's relevant to highlight some of the key findings of the Forest and Finance database. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, 20 PRB signatories have provided over 52 billion US dollars in finance to forest risk commodity companies that are driving deforestation in the tropical forest regions of Brazil, Southeast Asia, and Central and West Africa. As the fires are intentionally lit to clear land for agriculture, most notably for palm oil and pulp and paper in recent years, it's worth noting that among the top financiers in Southeast Asia, there are several Indonesian and Malaysian banks which are not PRB members, but also CIMB and Mitsubishi Financial Group, which have signed the principles. In order to turn the tide on the devastating social and environmental impacts endemic to the forest risk commodity sectors, banks and investors need to move faster in larger numbers and across more regions to adopt stronger ESG standards and due diligence processes. Financial sector regulation has a critical role to play in accelerating and shaping this agenda, and in order to ensure the economy serves public policy objectives. So we can see now that there are a few questions. The first one is that, do you see any improvement in the trends of finance flowing to forest risk commodity companies over the past years? think perhaps Meryl can answer this question.
Yes, thank you, Marilia. Yeah, so what we actually see that in the past 5 years, so since the Paris Agreement was signed, overall, the amount of finance that is allocated to forest risk commodity companies has increased. It's rising, which is a quite worrying trend, considering that most of these banks don't have NDPE policies, or if they have them, they don't. They're not properly implemented. So yeah, it's a worrying trend. Regarding policies, we also, on our website, we have a policy assessment, but the assessment is from 2018, so we still have to update it. This will be done early next year. So that will be a moment to assess how policies are improving. But on the finance, it's concerning.
Okay, great. We have another question is, how have the financial institutions engaged with the clients about the fire hotspots? Meryl or Vard?
Bart, would you like to take that one?
I think it's more for you or Gun, actually.
Thank you for the question. This is important for all financial services institutions. In our experience, financial services institutions do not know who are the subsidiaries of holding companies. Usually, their records are only of the holding companies like Sinermas. In our experience, when we share this information to financial services institution or the Indonesian Financial Services Authority, they do not know that companies linked to fires are subsidiaries of Sinermas. This is not easy. Therefore, we need to synergize. The Indonesian Financial Services Authority must immediately, as additional information, they have not published their new roadmap. The old roadmap ends in 2019. It contains an important point about managing ESG risk, or environment, social, and governance risk. Banks need to have a guidance on how to engage their clients, and they must open access to public to feed information to financial services institutions. In addition, Indonesian Financial Services Authority must also synergize with other law enforcement agencies in Indonesia, such as, for example, the Indonesian Commission for the Eradication of Corruption. They must cooperate also with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry that has a Directorate General of Law Enforcement. Land and forest fires include various actors, including corporates. When the Ministry of Environment and Forestry seals off a company for burning, financial services institutions must also be proactive and monitor this process and cooperate with the ministry. This will help to work together to anticipate future fires. Another important thing is that financial services institution, surely under the Indonesian Financial Services Authority's regulations, must impose strict sanctions instead of only writing off letters to financial services institution. But they must impose sanctions for those that are still financing these clients. And as I said, transparency is a common challenge. So there must be a coordination with line ministries, such as the Ministry of Law and Human Rights, where nearly all of these companies are reporting to that ministry about their beneficial owners. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, for your answer. We have another question. What is the role of the Indonesian Financial Authority in promoting sustainable finance? Maybe Eddie, you can also answer this one.
In the Indonesian regulation, the Indonesian Financial Services Authority, or OJK, has the authority to do so. Since 2015 to 2019, OJK has a roadmap. In this roadmap, it realizes that financial services institutions have a capacity gap in understanding sustainability. In its planning, so for the second roadmap for 2020 to 2024, the second roadmap begins to discuss about ESG management, ESG risk management. However, this roadmap is not yet published. OJK must hurry. Secondly, we believe that OJK must reactivate their Sustainable Finance Communication Forum. This is where stakeholders can sit together and share information and also work together to create this sustainable finance. This can also help achieve monitoring of this regulation. We are aware that OJK does not have the capacity to conduct field monitoring, so they must coordinate with other state agencies. So OJK has begun to create the roadmap. So the draft is there, but it must be published immediately. If it does not immediately publish their new roadmap on sustainable finance, this will be a threat to our forest specifically and to the environment in Indonesia in general. The roadmap discusses not only the forest sector, but also about protection and sustainable finance in Indonesia. Thank you.
Itu tambahan informasinya.
Thank you, Eddie, for your answer. I think we have time just for one more question, which is, do you have the number for the amount of financing to forest risk commodities before the Paris Agreement?
Yes, I think I'll take that one, Maria. Thank you. Yes, that's a good question. So when we started Forest and Finance a few years ago, we actually had data for Southeast Asian financing for a slightly longer period from 2010 onwards. But for Brazil and Central and West Africa, we only have data from 2013. So in Forest and Finance dataset, we now have 2013 onwards, and we've been reporting the figures from 2016 onwards. So in 2013, there was about 31 billion. In 2014, about 37 billion. There was a dip in 2015 to about 27 billion. And it's been rising again since then from 27 billion to, well, in 2019 at 39 billion. So there was a dip around 2015, but it's now surpassing the highest levels that we saw in 2014. We see particularly strong development in financing in Brazil. There's a similar trend in Southeast Asia, but it's relatively stable. Like the magnitude of escalation is much higher in Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Vart. We are running out of time, so I just would like to thank you all on behalf of all the partners. And thanks for joining the webinar, and I hope to see you on the next time.